Sometimes a question is just a question, and sometimes it opens a door that changes everything behind it. Raymond Okafor was standing at the Family Feud podium on a Thursday afternoon in April 2024, thinking about survey answers. He was trying to stay focused. He was trying to remember the categories his family had drilled in the hotel room the night before. He was not thinking about what he was about to say to Steve Harvey. He was not thinking about the fact that what he said next would leave every person in that studio silent for almost 45 seconds. He was not thinking about the millions of people who would eventually watch this moment on a screen and feel something they hadn't expected to feel that day. All Raymond was thinking about was winning enough money to fix what was broken. He had no idea that Steve Harvey had already decided to help him, and that the way he was going to do it had nothing to do with the game. Like and subscribe right now, because what happens in the next 20 minutes will stay with you for a long time. Raymond Okafor was 48 years old. He had come to the United States from Nigeria 22 years earlier, with a degree in accounting, $40 in his wallet, and the address of a distant uncle in Houston written on a piece of paper, folded into his shirt pocket. The uncle was not home when he arrived. Raymond knocked on that door for 20 minutes before a neighbor told him the man had moved to Dallas 6 months earlier. Raymond sat on the front step of a stranger's house in Houston for 3 hours, not because he was lost, but because he was thinking. He did not panic. He did not cry. He simply sat with the situation until he understood what the next step was. That capacity to sit still inside a problem and find the way through without falling apart would define Raymond Okafor for the next 2 decades. He found a room to rent. He found work at a shipping company doing inventory. He studied for his American accounting certifications at night, at the kitchen table of a one-bedroom apartment he shared with 2 other men he had met at church. He passed his exams on the first try. He moved from the shipping company to a small accounting firm, then to a larger one. By his 15th year in the country, he was a senior accountant at a mid-size firm in Houston and owned a 3-bedroom home in a quiet neighborhood where his children rode their bikes after school. He had 3 children. His oldest, Amara, was 20 and studying nursing at Prairie View A&M. His middle child, Emmanuel, was 16. His youngest, Grace, was 11, and Grace was the reason Raymond was standing on the Family Feud stage. 8 months earlier, Grace had been diagnosed with a rare autoimmune condition affecting her joints. It was not life-threatening, but it required ongoing physical therapy, specialist visits, and medication that their insurance covered only partially. The gap between what insurance paid and what the treatments actually cost had been widening for months. Raymond had pulled from savings. He had restructured their household budget twice. He had stopped contributing to his own retirement account. He had not told his wife, Patricia, exactly how close to the edge they were. He didn't want her to worry more than she already did. Patricia was already driving Grace to appointments twice a week, already managing the insurance paperwork, already carrying what she could carry. Raymond carried the rest of it quietly, the way he had learned to carry things since the night he sat on a stranger's front step in Houston and chose not to panic. The Family Feud application had been Patricia's idea. She had seen an episode while sitting in Grace's therapy waiting room and thought, Raymond knows everything. He watches game shows. He could do this. She filled out the application on her phone while Grace was in her session. Raymond had laughed when she told him. Then he said yes. Then he recruited his sister, his brother-in-law, and his cousin to round out the team. They practiced every weekend for 6 weeks. Raymond made spreadsheets of the most common survey answers organized by category. His sister thought he was being ridiculous. His brother-in-law memorized the spreadsheets anyway. What none of them knew was that when Patricia had submitted the application, she had written a note in the comments section. Just a few sentences about Grace and what the family was going through. She hadn't told Raymond. She thought it might improve their chances of being selected. It did, but not in the way she expected. The Okafor family was prepared. Raymond had done what Raymond always did. He had studied the problem thoroughly and shown up ready. They won the main game decisively. Raymond was calm at the podium in a way that made even Steve Harvey take notice. Most contestants fidget. Most contestants talk too fast, or freeze entirely. Raymond stood still, thought for exactly 1 beat, and answered. His family fed off that steadiness. They played like a unit. Steve had been watching him since the opening round. There was something about Raymond that didn't quite fit the typical contestant energy. Not because he was cold or stiff, but because he was centered in a way that suggested he had learned, at some point, how to be calm inside very difficult circumstances. Steve had interviewed enough people to recognize that quality. It wasn't something you developed in easy times. When the main game ended and the Okafor family celebrated, Steve walked over to Raymond during the commercial break. The cameras were technically rolling for backup footage, but it was the kind of moment that wasn't scripted. "You've been here before," Steve said. It wasn't a question. Raymond looked at him. "What do you mean? That calm. That's not a game show calm. That's something else." Raymond considered this. "I've had to learn how to stay steady," he said simply. Steve nodded. He said, "Tell me that story." Then the break ended and they moved into the fast money setup. But Steve didn't forget the exchange. The family chose Raymond to go second in fast money. They're closer. His niece went first and scored 121 points. That left Raymond needing 79 points, a challenging but achievable number. As Raymond walked to the podium, Steve met him there. The audience was loud and excited. Steve raised a hand to quiet them, and the room settled faster than usual. "Raymond," Steve said, "before we play, I want to finish what we started." Raymond tilted his head slightly. "You told me you learned how to stay steady. I want to know where you learned that." The audience was quiet now. Raymond looked out at his family. Patricia was watching him carefully. Grace was sitting between her aunt and uncle, her small hands folded in her lap. Raymond looked back at Steve. "I came to this country alone," he said. "I arrived at an address that turned out to be wrong. I sat on the steps of a house that wasn't mine, in a city where I knew no one, with $40 and no plan." He paused. "That afternoon taught me something. Panic doesn't solve problems. Thinking solves problems. So I learned to think instead of panic." The studio was completely silent. Steve said, "And you've been doing that ever since?" "I've had reasons to," Raymond said. "Tell me about Grace," Steve said quietly. Raymond went very still. He had not expected that name. He had not told anyone on that stage about Grace. He had not mentioned her condition to the producers during the pre-show interview. He had kept that part of the story private, the way he kept most things private, carrying them in that careful interior way that had gotten him across 22 years of difficult stretches. He looked at Steve. "How do you know about Grace?" he asked. Steve's expression was steady and kind. "Patricia told us," he said in the application. Raymond closed his eyes for 1 second. When he opened them, something had shifted in his. Face not broken. Raymond Okafor did not break easily, but moved. Genuinely, visibly moved. "She didn't tell me that," he said. "I know," Steve said. "She wanted to give you a fair shot without putting more pressure on you." Raymond exhaled slowly. He looked over at Patricia. She was watching him from across the stage with an expression that was equal parts apology and love. He shook his head slowly and smiled at her, not the smile of someone who was upset, the smile of someone who had just understood something. "That woman," he said softly, to no one in particular. Steve said, "Tell me about your daughter." And Raymond told him. He told Steve about the diagnosis, about the appointments twice a week, about the medication and the physical therapy and the insurance gaps that had been quietly draining the savings account he had built over 15 years of careful living. He didn't use emotional language. He described it the way an accountant describes a balance sheet, clearly, accurately, with no numbers hidden. But the love in it was unmistakable. "She doesn't complain," Raymond said. "She is 11 years old and she goes to those therapy sessions and she does the exercises and she comes home and does her homework and doesn't complain. I don't know where she got that from." There was a small ripple of gentle laughter from the audience, because everyone watching could see clearly where Grace had gotten it from. Steve let the moment breathe. Then he said, "Raymond, I want to show you something." He turned to the side of the stage, and a production assistant walked out carrying a large framed certificate. Steve took it and held it so Raymond could read it. Raymond read it. He read it once. Then he read it again. Then he looked up at Steve. "What is this?" he asked. "That," Steve said, "is a commitment from 3 of our partners, a children's health foundation, a pharmaceutical assistance program, and my own foundation, to cover Grace's therapy and medication costs in full for the next 2 years. Every copay, every specialist visit, every prescription." The studio exploded. Raymond did not explode. Raymond stood at the podium and pressed both hands flat against the surface in front of him, looking down, as if he needed something solid to hold on to. His shoulders rose and fell once with a breath that was slow and deliberate and the most human thing anyone in that building had seen in a long time. He was doing what Raymond Okafor always did. He was staying steady, but this time it was costing him something to do it. Grace had stood up from her seat. Her aunt had a hand on her shoulder, but Grace was leaning forward, watching her father. She was 11 years old, and she understood exactly what had just been said. "Daddy," she called out. That was the word that broke it. Raymond lifted his head. He looked at his youngest daughter standing there across the stage, and the steadiness he had carried since a front step in Houston 22 years ago gave way for just a moment. His face did what faces do when a man who has held things together for a very long time finally hears that someone else is going to help him hold it. He walked around the podium. Steve stepped back. Grace met him halfway, and Raymond went down on one knee so he was at her height and held her with both arms, and she put her small hands on his back, and the studio audience made a sound that was not applause exactly. It was something softer and more collective than that. Patricia had both hands over her mouth. Emmanuel, their 16-year-old, was looking at the ceiling the way teenage boys look at the ceiling when they are trying not to cry in public. Steve Harvey stood with his hands clasped and his head slightly bowed and said nothing. He knew when a moment didn't need any words added to it. When Raymond stood back up, Grace held his hand. He walked back to the podium with his daughter beside him. Steve looked at the two of them. "You still have fast money to play," he said gently. Raymond nodded. He straightened his jacket. He looked at Grace. "Go sit down, baby," he said. "I have some work to finish." Grace went back to her seat. The audience laughed warmly. Steve said, "You ready?" Raymond looked at him. "Steve," he said, "I have been ready since Houston." Raymond scored 91 points. His family won $20,000. They celebrated the way the Okafor family did most things, with real joy and without excess. Raymond hugged each of them, shook his brother-in-law's hand, and kissed Patricia on the cheek. Grace ran onto the stage and he picked her up. The clip of Steve reading out the 2-year medical commitment and the moment Grace called out to her father from across the stage was online before the episode had finished taping. By the following morning, it had been shared more than 12 million times. It was the kind of clip that travels across age groups and across the usual lines that separate what different kinds of people watch and care about. Because it wasn't really about a game show and everyone who saw it knew it. It was about a man who had spent 22 years solving problems quietly, who had never asked for help he didn't earn, who had sat on a stranger's front step in Houston as a young man with no plan and chosen thinking over panic, and who had finally been seen for the full weight of what he carried. The response online was immediate and lasting. Thousands of comments came from people who recognized Raymond's particular kind of strength, not the loud kind, the kind that shows up in early mornings and spreadsheets and half-truths told to a wife to keep her from worrying more than she needs to, the kind of strength that leaves no visible marks because it never makes a scene. Raymond appeared on Steve Harvey's radio program the following week. He was composed, precise, and gracious. When Steve asked him what it had felt like to stand there and receive that kind of help, Raymond thought for a moment before answering. "In my culture," he said, "there is a concept. It does not translate perfectly, but it is something like, the community is the safety net. No one falls alone. I came to America and I did not always feel that net. I learned to provide my own. That day, for the first time in a long time, I felt the net again, and I did not realize how much I had missed it until it was there." That answer was quoted in 4 newspaper articles and cited in an opinion piece about immigrant families and the social support systems that often fail to reach them. Grace Okafor began her new treatment schedule 3 weeks after the episode aired. Her physical therapist, who had been following her case for 8 months, noted a measurable improvement in her mobility. Within the first 6 weeks of the expanded program, the additional specialist visits allowed the medical team to adjust her treatment plan in ways that had not been possible under the previous financial constraints. Grace herself, when asked by a school reporter for her 5th-grade class newsletter what the best thing about her year had been, wrote, "My dad went on a game show and they asked him a question and he told the truth, and good things happened. I think that's the lesson." Her teacher framed it and put it on the classroom wall. Patricia eventually told Raymond the full story of the application note, not just that she had written something, but what she had written and why. She told him one evening after dinner, when the children had gone upstairs and the kitchen was quiet. Raymond listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You should have told me." "I know," she said, "but I understand why you didn't." "I know," she said again. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. They sat like that for a while in the quiet kitchen of the house he had bought after 15 years of careful work, in the country where he had arrived with $40 in Tate, wrong address and the right instincts. The Steve Harvey Foundation announced 3 months after the episode that the children's health initiative it had helped launch in connection with Grace's case would be expanded into a formal grant program for families of children with chronic conditions facing insurance gaps. It was one of the fastest program launches in the Foundation's history, in part because of the volume of calls and emails the Foundation received from families describing situations nearly identical to the Okafors. The demand revealed something that the medical and social services system had long underserved: families who earn enough not to qualify for public assistance, but not enough to absorb the uncovered costs of serious, ongoing illness. Families who are too proud to ask for help. Families led by people like Raymond Okafor, who had learned to solve problems quietly and carry the weight without letting it show. Raymond returned to his accounting firm the Monday after the episode aired. His colleagues had seen the clip. A few of them stopped by his office to say something. Raymond thanked them briefly and returned to work. At lunch, a younger colleague, a man in his late 20s who had emigrated from Ghana 3 years earlier, knocked on his office door and stood in the doorway. "Mr. Raymond," he said, "I watched the clip 6 times." Raymond looked up from his desk. "I have a situation at home that I haven't told anyone about," the young man said. "I didn't think anyone would understand." Raymond set down his pen. "Close the door," he said. "Sit down, tell me." That conversation lasted 40 minutes. At the end of it, Raymond made 2 phone calls. One to a social services organization he had never needed to call before, and one to a colleague in the benefits department who knew how to navigate insurance appeals. 2 months later, the young man's situation had improved substantially. He told Raymond afterward that he had almost not knocked on that door, that he had stood in the hallway for several minutes deciding whether to turn around and go back to his desk. "What made you knock?" Raymond asked. The young man said, "Because you were on television and you told the truth about something hard, and good things happened. I thought if Raymond can do it, maybe I can do it too." Raymond considered this for a moment. "You don't need to be on television," he said. "You just have to say the true thing to the right person." He paused. "Patricia figured that out before I did," he added. 1 year after the episode aired, Grace Okafor's medical team delivered a progress report that her parents called the best hour of their year. Her condition was stable. Her mobility had improved beyond the original projections. She was playing on her school's junior soccer team and had been voted team captain by her teammates. Raymond framed the progress report. He put it on the wall of his office, beside his accounting certifications and a small photograph of a street in Houston that he had taken on a visit some years earlier. A photograph of a front step outside an ordinary house, in a neighborhood where a young man had once sat alone for 3 hours and decided that thinking was better than panic. He never explained to anyone what the photograph was of. They didn't need to know. He knew. That was enough. Steve Harvey, in an interview near the end of that television season, was asked to name the moment from the year that had stayed with him most. He didn't hesitate. "Raymond Okafor," he said, because he came in thinking it was just a question. And it was. But the answer he gave, the truth he was willing to say out loud, that opened something for his family, and I think for a lot of people watching who recognize themselves in him. He paused. "The quiet ones," Steve said, "the people who carry everything without saying a word, they deserve to be asked the right question, too." Raymond Okafor did not watch that interview when it aired. He was at Grace's soccer game. She scored twice. He stood on the sideline in the cold with his hands in his coat pockets and watched his daughter run, and he did not think about survey answers or studio lights or viral clips. He thought, "This is why you stay steady, not for the good days. For this, for the ordinary, extraordinary fact of your child healthy and running in the cold afternoon, doing exactly what she is supposed to be doing, completely unaware of everything it cost to get her here." That thought required no answer. It simply was. Raymond Okafor stood on the sideline and let it be.